as somebody with a background in science, qualification in science, and as an experimental test pilot in the military, in fact commanding Australia's Flight Test Centre, working in a systems engineering environment where we were very much based on facts and data and engineering, but a good dose of modelling in there as well. I'm actually very familiar with the sort of approach that the CSIRO has taken, and as the minister indicated, we do have things like Senate estimates, and I did take the opportunity to go to Senate estimates to speak to the CSIRO about the GenCost report. Well, it may come as a surprise to the minister, but when I asked the head of the CSIRO to speak about the GenCost report, having made it clear to the committee that I intended to appear at those estimates to ask about the GenCost report, and therefore the expectation is the agencies who are being quizzed will bring the appropriate officials in order to be able to answer detailed questions to estimates. I was told that the appropriate officials were not there, and the only responses that I got to some reasonably detailed questions were very generic. And so, contrary to what the minister has indicated, estimates actually proved completely useless in terms of interrogating the CSIRO over the GenCost report. I can't speak to the motivation of CSIRO by not bringing those officials, but what it meant was that members of the Senate, on behalf of the taxpayers of Australia, were not able to scrutinise them in any detail. If we took the minister's contention that he just outlined then and applied it more broadly, there would be no point in having committees of the parliament at all, because in matters to do with health, for example, we might ask the AMA to draft our policy and scrutinise it. In matters to do with defence, we would rely on the Defence Department and perhaps defence industry, and there would be no point in having any scrutiny on behalf of the Australian taxpayer. And yet the minister knows full well, because he has been a member of committees in this place, that the whole function of the committees in getting a range of witnesses who are stakeholders affected by policy or who are subject matter experts who understand the technical details, whether it is health, whether it is economics, whether it is defence, you name it. The whole point of having the Senate process with committees is so that we can unpack and understand what is behind a policy or a piece of evidence. And so the last point I'll make on this, since the minister has so kindly given me this introductory runway to approach this issue, is the 2019 House of Representatives inquiry into the possibility of a nuclear power industry. Now, what was particularly interesting then, this is going back to the 2018 GenCost report, and so if I look at the Hansard records from that, I believe it was the 16th of October. Yes, Wednesday the 16th of October in 2019. Now, the taxpayers of Australia, given the minister's comment there that the CSIRO, and I respect the CSIRO as somebody who has a science degree, I respect the whole discipline of science, which is observation and measurement and proof, when they were quizzed in this parliamentary inquiry about the GenCost report, and I'll paraphrase here, but for those of you who'd like to read it, pull up the Hansard from the House of Representatives, Wednesday the 16th of October from this committee. Essentially, the narrative went like this. CSIRO, we don't have any expertise in electricity generation by nuclear energy. And so the committee asked, well, where did you get the figures from then that you used in your report? And they said, well, we contracted an external consultant to provide those figures for us. And so the committee, if you look through the Hansard, you'll see they met on a sequence of days. Why did they do that? Because as each piece of evidence unfolded, they dug a bit deeper. And so they had that consultant come in and said, fantastic, describe for us where you got the information from. What the consultant said was, well, we don't have any expertise in nuclear power generation, so we went to the internet. And we went to the website of the World Nuclear Association to find information. And so, following day, another hearing, a representative from the World Nuclear Association, and the committee said, "Did you have this figure on your website?" And they said, "No, we didn't have it on our website, and more to the point, we think it is grossly inflated and unrepresentative of what the true costs would be." Now, to the CSIRO's great credit, they took all that on board, and I think they have been far more robust in how they've approached it since. But to directly address the minister's point, the benefit of a committee process with a range of witnesses able to challenge and highlight the assumptions that have been made, highlighted that that GenCost report, the 2018 GenCost report, was not based on any robust analysis of the facts of the cost even of generation of electricity, let alone an analysis of the likely price to the consumer. So I will leave that there, but I'm hoping that that actually completely debunks the minister's assertion that there is no value to a parliamentary inquiry because estimates has not worked, which he proposed it would, and a parliamentary committee did highlight that in this particular domain the CSIRO did not have expertise, and the paths they went down to deliver figures proved on the public record to not be robust. So why do I support this? Well, partly because I believe in that committee process, but partly also from someone who has worked in an engineering environment using modelling as somebody with a qualification in science. I recognise that the GenCost report is largely a modelling activity as opposed to science. If you search the PDF of the GenCost report, the word assumption appears some 54 times. And like most modelling, you have to make assumptions. And there are a range of assumptions in GenCost that they identify themselves are not necessarily representative of the complete suite of factors that we consider. And I have some empathy for them. It's a complex problem. But there's a few things that I think the Australian public need to be aware of, that when Mr Bowen and others cite this as the be-all and end-all, the gospel according to the CSIRO that shall not be challenged, that it is a modelling exercise with assumptions based on an incomplete set of data. And there are other expert bodies in Australia and around the world who have also done modelling and come up with quite different answers to the same questions, which is why we should put before the Australian people the opportunity to see different experts in the field address their modelling, their assumptions and, more importantly, their lived experience so that the Australian people can decide whether this is something that we should be moving towards. So the first point is that this modelling is not designed to understand what is the most effective way to get cheap and reliable electricity to the Australian consumer, whether that be mum and dad at home, whether that be a small business, or whether that be an industrial sector that will probably go offshore if the power prices continue to increase. And so in paragraph 1.1.1, describing the CSIRO and AEMO roles in GenCost report, it is to provide an update of the current electricity generation and storage costs. It's not about highlighting the cheapest way to get electricity. It also talks about the levelised cost of electricity, which is all around the factors affecting the cost to generation as opposed to the full system's costs. And the third point I would make is that they highlight, and this is in paragraph 1.2, so page 16 of the GenCost report, and I'll quote here. As discussed in Graham 2018, it's not possible to undertake a spreadsheet-type modelling to create a transparent but accurate estimate of the cost of integrating renewables. This is, and end quote there, this is one of the significant factors that affect the analysis of whether a renewables-based approach can be comparable in terms of delivering reliability and low cost to the consumer versus baseload type approaches, whether that be rivers providing, high-flow rivers providing hydro, or things like nuclear power. So they're saying here that they can't provide a transparent and accurate estimate cost of integrating renewables. To requote, if it were, this would have been the preferred method of implementation in GenCost. Again, they quote Graham. Graham 2018 concluded an electricity system modelling approach must be applied where the details of the calculations are written in code that call on proprietary optimisation algorithms, which unfortunately results in a loss of transparency. End quote. Now, I'm not saying that the CSIRO is in any way being malign in how they're approaching this, but their chosen vendor, their chosen model, their chosen algorithms, their chosen assumptions are but one set that feeds into a model that gives an outcome of cost to generation. Other equally expert bodies, and I'm talking here about people like the International Energy Agency, the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, and their subsidiary, the NEA, the Nuclear Energy Agency, which have worked together over a number of years to model not cost to generate, but cost to the consumer. And what they highlight is that simple measure, the levelised cost of electricity, which even GenCost recognises, is not a suitable cost for this analysis and comparison. The OECD report, which came out in April of 2022, looks at a systems-wide approach. And what they demonstrate very clearly is that what they call long-run nuclear power, even from an LCOE, the levelised cost of electricity basis, is the cheapest form of electricity. So run a plant for a long time, it becomes, over the life of that asset, the cheapest way to generate power. They also highlight in that analysis that even new build nuclear is on a par with grid-scale renewables, but cheaper than others, for example, rooftop or offshore wind, etc. It's actually cheaper than those. If you then apply the systems costs, and they break it down, for people who are interested, if you have a look at pages 35 to 37 of that OECD report, they break down the elements into the generating costs, the systems costs and the broader environmental costs. They highlight that as we seek to move to curb emissions, that we will probably get to 2030 with rising power prices, but not unaffordable power prices. But if we seek to get to net zero by 2050, just using variable renewables with firming by things like batteries, then as more coal and gas come out of the system in order to achieve that net zero, the prices go exponentially up, and their conclusion is that it is unaffordable. This is not the coalition. This is the OECD and the International Energy Agency. And that is why people like the IPCC are saying we need to have nuclear power as part of the mix. That's why so many nations around the world are looking to double or triple the amount of nuclear power generation that they have. And so the last point I'd make is that despite the government's claim it's the cheapest, that nuclear is the most expensive form, the lived experience of people like Canada says otherwise. And if you look at some of the information coming out of Canada, you can see that nuclear even is cheaper than hydro, certainly than gas, wind and solar and bioenergy, in how their energy board in Ontario manages things. And it's partly because of the broader costs that variable renewables have in terms of the additional infrastructure. My last point will be around the Net Zero Australia project done by 3 universities and a consultancy, which highlighted that the cost of all the additional transmission and firming, as well as the new generation, by 2030 is going to cost us in the order of $1.2 to $1.5 trillion, and by 2060, $7 to $9 trillion. the nuclear option is actually far cheaper than the variable path the Albanese government has us on.